Okay, thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. We have two presentations today. One from Beth Fielding-Lloyd about the role models and trailblazers, staging and promoting women's football in international competition. And the second from Dr. Jack Black, sport and alt-right, woke conspiracies during Euro 2020. So we'll start with the first presentation, and after we can have questions and answers before proceeding to the second stage. I will leave you the floor with Beth.
Thank you.
It is recording as well, so I hope there's no problem with that. Share the screen.
Share screen.
Yeah.
Go to. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Sorry, 1 second, guys. Okay, can everyone see that? Someone give me a thumbs up.
Yeah, I can see that.
All right, thanks everyone. So in this presentation, I'd like to explore one part of a wider book project that I'm actually working on that interrogates the history and contemporary terrain of women's soccer and the path to progress in women's equality today. I'm going to be focusing on the key discourses of the marketing and branding and build up to the World Cup this summer, and presenting an argument as to what I think it shows us about current dominant cultural understandings of the sport and its development. So just get a bit of context and intro before we start. We do know that women's football has been persistently marketed and framed for audiences based on the assumption, based on the premise that it's only of interest to families and young girls. That's been evident in the launch of professional leagues in many nations. The US, Donna and I have done plenty of work on the launch of the Women's Super League in England and elsewhere in Europe. What this work has shown us is that common assumptions of women's football, both the fans and the audiences in general, are seen as not as serious or as non-serious by tournament organisers and the governing institutions such as the Football Association. There's kind of representation of the game not being as competitive as other forms of football. There's a real, and this is going to be a particular focus of my presentation today, there's a real focus on football in particular as a source of role models and empowerment for young girls and women. It has very real effects in that there's, I would argue that women's football, that the potential of the sport and women's sport generally as a product to be sold to audiences is not trusted as of yet. So for example, there's limited amounts of merchandise. So you'll find at major tournaments that, for example, football shirts are only available in smaller sizes. They're only available in a woman's cut because despite evidence to the contrary, it's not perceived by kind of major corporations that men would ever want to buy merchandise for a women's team. And it's generally positioned as a convenient form of family entertainment rather than a sport in itself. What I'd like to argue kind of more generally really is that all this contributes to the prominent deployment of neoliberal myths of women's empowerment within very traditional feminine frames, and female heroic narratives. So to kind of go a little bit more in depth into that idea of kind of neoliberal myths, what I would like to argue, and what others such as Bannett Weiser have argued, is that in its prioritisation of free markets and individual responsibility, neoliberalism is really well placed, really well suited to common ideas of sport as the absolute pinnacle of meritocratic achievement. What that means is, from this stance, women's progress in sport is framed as achievable through individual responsibility. And what that means is that any kind of continued problematic or exclusionary practices are obscured because the focus is always on the individual's responsibility to achieve. Before I kind of give some specific examples, what I argue that means is that it undermines any potential or any existing politicization of the game or its players in terms of their feminism. And it centers any kind of women's progress, as I say, on individual responsibility without recognition of those kind of very real continued restrictions that exist. So, for example, there's a popular narrative within sports culture that girls need to be liberated through sports. There's a general concern with girls' personal and social advancement and the positioning of sport as a means of strengthening girls' confidence and advancing their potential, which we have seen. You can see the images on the side of the screen there in the kind of mottos of previous and existing Women's World Cup tournaments. So you have the She Believes Cup. You have Women's World Cup in 2015, which was hashtag live your goals, and the Women's World Cup in 2019, which was hashtag dare to shine. What I and others would argue is that what this means is that any kind of notion of gendered emancipation within this context can be kind of stripped of its history and its institutions and is remade in very individualized terms. So basically, young players and young fans, all they need to do is be confident in themselves so they shine. They need to believe in themselves and live their goals, and therefore equality will be achieved. That's the kind of wider context, I think, and background to my more general argument. Looking specifically at this study, we're focusing on the Women's World Cup, which, if you're not aware, is going to be hosted between Australia and New Zealand. Kicks off 20th of July this summer. As I said, the wider study is not specifically focused on the Women's World Cup and is more about kind of more general audience building and promotion and media coverage of women's football within recent years. The focus of this particular aspect of the study is a critical discourse analysis of the branding, the promotional campaign for the upcoming tournament. And I'm hoping to kind of provide you with some examples of that today. Just kind of some further context to this particular tournament, which we think makes it worthy of analysis. So after the relative success of the Women's World Cup in 2019, FIFA in its women and girls strategy asserted that women's football is on the cusp of a dramatic transformation. And as you can see there, that was evidenced in Australia and New Zealand's bid for the 23 tournament in itself. I'll probably come back to this later. On the one hand, I'm arguing that this tournament is of particular interest because it's said to be on the cusp of dramatic transformation for the women's game. Well, on the other hand, we've been here before. So this was said in 2005 when England hosted the Euros. It was said in England in 2012 when we hosted the Olympics. It was said at the 2015 World Cup, 2019, and so on and so on. So we've been here before, but I'll get back to that later today. The early signs are perhaps that media conglomerates might not share that enthusiasm. So again, kind of going back to my previous point that women's football isn't yet, I don't think, trusted as a business and product to be sold. The first bids for the broadcast rights were actually rejected by FIFA for being unacceptably low. So it seems that kind of that belief in women's football as a product, despite its improving participation rates and viewing figures, isn't necessarily trusted sufficiently yet, but I'll talk about that later. In terms of the partners and sponsors of the 23 tournament, there's been some major sponsors that have been secured, which is encouraging. However, FIFA has appeared less selective in other ways. So you may have heard in January 23, the hosts, Australia and New Zealand themselves, were quite surprised to find out that FIFA were planning on appointing Visit Saudi as a sponsor for the tournament, which was met with immediate, very vocal condemnation from players and queries from the hosts, highlighting that such a sponsorship ran counter to FIFA's promise to pay attention to human rights and to enforce its own rights and non-discrimination policies. And I'd argue that such a sponsorship choice for the flagship women's tournament was at best tone deaf, particularly amid widespread criticism of the Men's World Cup being held in Qatar just the previous month, but also at worst demonstrated a complete disregard and failure to consider the issues that are very salient for women players, bearing in mind that there's a significant number of international players who are openly gay, and women's rights more broadly. Just last month, FIFA, well, they didn't say that they'd withdrawn Visit Saudi as sponsors, but they said they weren't going to progress that relationship anymore. So Visit Saudi are no longer going to be sponsors for the World Cup. but in the same month also announced as the new FIFA Global Fan Ambassador. She's pictured there, but I've forgotten her surname. I don't know if anyone on the call is up on their supermodel knowledge, but she's called Adriana something. And she is the new Global Fan Ambassador just prior to the tournament this year. FIFA's accounts of her appointment describe her as apparently she lives and breathes football. But her well-documented anti-abortion stance and advocacy of extreme dieting methods meant that the appropriateness of her appointment was widely criticised. And again, I'd argue that it demonstrates FIFA's misunderstanding of how such heteronormative feminized ideals are very much contradictory to any notion of empowerment that we may have seen through those previous, hashtag live your goals, hashtag dare to shine, hashtag, et cetera, et cetera. Indeed, kind of going back to those, if you remember those previous mottos, the motto for the upcoming World Cup is hashtag beyond greatness. Is the official strapline of this World Cup. It's currently being promoted by a range of Beyond Greatness champions who I've pictured here. They're described on the website as inspirational trailblazers, and they're all from Australia and New Zealand, and they range from a Paralympian, a sports presenter, there's a retired footballer, there's a snowboarder, a sports major executive. What I'm doing is I'm examining kind of bit by bit the promotional content of that motto as it emerges up to and including the tournament. For now, I can present you with a quote from the COO of the tournament. I'll just give you a second to read that. So the World Cup is going to create history makers. It's going to make change right across Australia and New Zealand. What a better team of inspirational people to celebrate our own history makers. Our greatness champions will help shape moments of empowerment for generations to come. One of the many questions I would ask about that rather vague strapline is exactly who it is that is going beyond greatness. By using the profiles of a range of individuals who have apparently achieved greatness in their respective fields, I'm assuming that it's the players, which I would argue reinforces that, again, that kind of notion of individualized neoliberal achievement through sporting success. The responsibilities of the Australian and the New Zealand football associations in helping make that change are entirely invisible. And I have done a preliminary, I need to do more work on this, a preliminary analysis of the bid books that were used by the winning associations to secure the tournament hosting. And they provided no evidence or no policy as to how they were actually going to enact that change other than inspiring young people. Despite the fact that research has shown that inspiration in itself and even role modeling in itself doesn't have any impact on participation in sport without the kind of infrastructure to being there to develop it, and also without those kinds of like closer family relationships that really support continued sport participation. I think it's also interesting, just a couple of other points on that quote. It's interesting to see that the aim of the tournament is to create moments of empowerment. I think it's contradictory to identify how empowerment for generations is achieved through moments. I would argue that that's not possible. It's only achieved through sustained, meaningful political change. And also, kind of going back to what I was saying previously, this emphasis again on history makers. What that does is it promulgates narratives of sport and social progress as inevitable and incremental. So, the 2005 Euro tournament, the 2012 Olympics, the England women winning the Euros 2022. Now this tournament, what that kind of history makers narrative promotes is that each tournament makes more history. And therefore the audience and people like me are discouraged from criticising any kind of prevailing inequalities because we are making gradual progress and that shouldn't be disrupted or complained about. Final example I'd like to show you today is the mascot for the forthcoming World Cup, and she is called Tazuni. Tazuni is apparently, I had to look this up, she's a penguin. She's a penguin based on a minor species that's apparently found in New Zealand and Australia. And on her launch, as you can see there, the FIFA secretary said that Tazuni stands for everything which makes the Women's World Cup unique, and her story will resonate with millions of young fans across the globe, around the world. So what we can see here, and I'll return to this in a little bit, is very much the emphasis here is on the tournament being marketed again towards young people. Further to that, FIFA also said that the story behind this mascot is that she is a 15-year-old midfielder who fell in love with football after playing the game on the beach one day. So again, there's this emphasis on moments. So social change within football isn't achieved through sustained kind of policy and infrastructure and those kind of like difficult, boring things, but is achieved through moments of empowerment and inspiration. And the name Tazuni is apparently a combination of Tasman Sea and unity. So again, the focus is not on competition, it's not on elite skill and competition, but on that kind of great sport myth of bringing people together. Couple of minor points that I'm still thinking about, really. I do wonder, perhaps it's a positive that the images projected of her so far, one of them is active. She's not got a football, but she's actually participating in some form of physical activity. It's not a passive stance, which you could argue is a positive. I do wonder if the hair is a reference to Megan Rapinoe, who's a really popular and perhaps more importantly political icon for the game. So we could see that as a positive. However, what I would suggest is the downside of consistently marketing women's sport as an appeal to children, which I would argue what this is doing again, at the expense of excluding perhaps older, perhaps more diverse audiences, is again that perceived lack of appeal on the basis of athletic talent and skill. So we're selling football as women's football as a tool to achieve things in society and to inspire people rather than watching an excellent sport. I would argue that that limits your marketing potential of the sport, because I'm not so sure that being preached to sells, whereas excitement sells. We see that in elite sport, and that's not the approach that's being taken yet again with women's football. It's not about the players displaying their skills in intense competition, but in achieving wider kind of social things. And I would suggest that this approach isn't working. Media broadcasters are still pretty apathetic about the Women's World Cup and aren't bidding for it in the same ways that we would expect kind of the current data to suggest. We're also seeing that the tournament is not only not being seen seriously by broadcasters, but also by football associations themselves. So we're seeing the French and Spanish players resigning. We've got Canada threatened to go on strike because they've not been given sufficient preparation for the tournament. They've not been given sufficient financial support, and we're starting to see that kind of player revolt in that sense. So what I think as my analysis develops, what I'm finding is that the key messages of the tournament branding are really successfully working to mask the very real prevailing unequal realities of major tournament operations that are impacting both players and fans. And I've provided some examples of that here. My argument is in this way, FIFA and the governing bodies of Australia and New Zealand are positioning themselves as benevolent advocates of women's sport and don't acknowledge their own complicity in those gender inequalities, but also their own roles in addressing it. I think that that's kind of the real issue, is that it lessens the pressure on institutions to do something and instead shifts the focus on kind of these very individualized ideas. I'm arguing that this approach both deprofessionalizes and infantilizes both players and fans. Of course, female representation and participation in many sports across the world needs to be increased, and their achievements need to be celebrated. However, the kinds of discourse that we're seeing that are foregrounding the players as role models and their message as empowerment places the responsibility in a different place than it should, I would argue. It renders invisible the wider kinds of socio-cultural and structural issues and diminishes that pressure to invest. It also, I would argue, depoliticizes women's sport and participation. I'm assuming because of a fear of alienating corporate partners and the media. However, what has been interesting, I think, which perhaps wasn't evident before the last World Cup, is that radical political discourse within women's sport can be commercially attractive. The US women's national team have never been more popular than they are now, and within their fight for equal pay in the US. We've seen, you might not be familiar with the case of the Portland Thorns, which are a US soccer kind of fan base who were heavily politicized and protesting against all sorts of issues of social justice and sexual abuse in women's sport that have proved incredibly commercially popular. So instead, and I'd like to, you know, if you take nothing else from this when you're watching the World Cup this summer, what you'll see in media representations of the tournament is a constant discourse and a relentless focus on development and growth of the game. So you can't kind of watch a game without there being a discussion of what does this mean for the women? What does it mean for the game? Rather than enjoying athletes selling their skills as a spectacle in its own right. Interestingly, and I think I might be digressing slightly here, those kind of previous work, and Jack and I published a paper on this a while ago and showed how media representations of women's football tend to present the game as being a fairer, kind of more sanitized, kind of cleaner version of the game. It's not like men's football because, oh, aren't they nice, aren't they fair play? You know, they don't hit each other, etc. We're starting to see, as the game develops and becomes more professionalized, those efforts to kind of sanitize the game are starting to impede on the product on the pitch. So there was a case, I don't know if you'll have heard of it, a couple of months ago, for example, where a Man United player, I think it was Ella Toone, got sent off because she was in a bit of a tussle with a Tottenham player and she shoved her on the ground, which, well, when I watched it, by football standards, it was a sending off. But when she shoved the Tottenham player definitely play acted a little bit. And where she'd been shoved, I think, on the shoulder, she kind of put her hands to her face in this kind of, you know, I've been hurt, play acted. She's since been, the red card for Ella Toone was rescinded, and then the Tottenham player got banned for 2 games for deceiving the referee. I do think there's an anxiety in the game that discourses of the women's game being kind of fairer and cleaner, that's not bearing out as the stakes in the professional game get higher. And I think there's a concern now on the pitch to reinforce those attitudes. So the women's game and the men's game on the pitch are now being policed very differently. And there's been several other examples of that. So that was a little bit of a digression, but I think I'm going to bring that into the analysis somehow. So my concluding comments would be that the tournament promotion so far, and I'm still collecting data on this, we've seen a lot of self-congratulatory discourses that are feigning positive, I would argue, kind of superficial progress rather than substantive change, which are distracting attention from the underlying inequalities that still exist within the game, as has been evidenced by players going on strike because of the lack of sufficient preparation for the tournament. I think FIFA, probably is no surprise to anybody, are still paying lip service to their claims to be attending to human rights and equality within the game, and that the whole kind of feminized empowerment marketing that we're still continuing to see, that's persisting despite growing evidence that the modern women's football audience, that's not what the specific evidence that shows that that's not what they want, and that women's football as kind of a socio-political space would actually be welcomed by the audiences, but rather that kind of any notion of feminism within women's sport is being very, very minimized despite kind of frequent acts of activism within the sport itself, which I'm finding contradictory. That's my concluding thoughts, and I think the slides will be made available, so the references are there as well. Thank you. Oh, Alison knew the name of the supermodel. Thank you, Alison. I don't know if you want to do questions later after Jack, or
we can do questions now and then.
Okay. Shall I stop sharing or?
No, continue. Have the questions.
Okay.
I can the presentation.
I'll leave it there on the references. Any questions? This is weird, isn't it? Hybrid, in person or in the Zoom room I think I had right. So Chris, how much of FIFA's approach do you think is based on a genuine desire to grow women's football or a reactive attempt to cash in on the current societal media focus? Oh, crap. I think it perhaps is genuine, but I don't think they know what they're doing. I think they're making assumptions as to that are very heteronormative, that are very feminine, and that they're working to market the product as a different version of kind of the failings of the men's game, such as its its hyper elite status and all the money and the commercialization. They wanted to present a version of football that is different. But I think as the game becomes more professionalized, albeit kind of in fits and starts, and the stakes get higher, that feminized framing doesn't hold. And I think they're struggling at the moment to know what to do with that. That makes sense. And I also think they need to improve the merchandising, which is shocking. Alison.
Thanks, Beth. As you know, I'm a physiologist, so this is way outside of my comfort zone. So I'll probably blunder my way through this question. First of all, thanks. I think it's always interesting what on a single occurrence is quite innocuous. So some of the kind of dare to aspire as an example of one of those things. You know, who wouldn't want to dare to aspire? But when you see it as a collective, how patronizing it actually all comes across. So my question is around the Tazumi character that you showed. There's a couple of comments. Well, one's a comment, one's a question. So the comment is around, you made a thing about the moments of empowerment. So on Tazumi on the beach, that was where the passion of football came. And I think you made a comment about it's based on these moments rather than policy change. But is it not that all mascots have these trite little examples that go alongside it? It's not encouraging for anyone, is it, to talk about policy? No. Kind of a comment, but the question is, how does this compare to men's tournament mascots? Do they not present in the same way?
I haven't done a direct comparison of mascots. That's fair. I think what I have done a comparison of is the hashtags. Those kind of and that it just doesn't translate to the men's game, men's football in general. And I'd also argue, like in a gaming context as well, you know, in FIFA, it's all about kind of being strong and powerful and being the best. And that's entirely absent from the women's game. I mean, just say beyond greatness, but I don't even really know what that means. It just reminds me of Buzz Lightyear. I can't get that out of my head at the moment. Which I need to get past. But I've not done a direct comparison to mascots. And that is a fair point, that mascots generally, you would think, you know, are typically aimed at the younger audience. I just think within the women's context, they could have done so much more, and they could have been much more diverse. But within the, as you say, like the repeated framings of women's football being about inspiring young girls, I think that's starting to have kind of a real impact on the actual professionalization of the sport. So something else I've starting to look into, which need to analyze it in greater depth, is, for example, at the end of, it's particularly prevalent in England, but at the end of Women's Super League games now, the women players are expected to go around the pitch and sign shirts and sign up for like up to half an hour after a game, which is lovely, because again, I think going back to Chris's question, that doesn't happen in the men's game because of the elite kind of celebrification of it. But it's getting to the point now where female players, they're getting harassed after games, that they're not staying afterwards for long enough because they should give back. When you would know as a physiologist, Alison, that the players should be prioritising the recovery, because they're professional athletes, not signing football shirts for 6-year-olds. And that's not sustainable, and I don't think professional leagues know what to do with that yet.
Thanks, Beth. Really interesting. Cheers.
Abby. Hi, Abby. What do you suggest should be done in order to challenge the I think there's lots of things that should be done. I don't know whether there's the willingness within women's football to challenge that. I think there's a nervousness around growing attendances, because when the league was in England was launched, the prime measure of success was judged as increasing attendances. That had to be the thing, that had to be the thing. And it was targeted towards, well, where's the audience going to be for this? Because everyone's already busy watching other sports. Who's not watching sport? Right, well, we'll go to the girls and their dads, and that was excluding existing audiences. I think it needs to be diverse. I think that's reflected in things like your marketing images, in terms of going back to my point about merchandising. If you're not selling merchandise, so for example, it's really difficult as a women's football fan, if you're a man, to get a shirt in a man's size. You're telling that audience that you're not wanted. So I think that there's no reason for women's football to be marketed to such a narrow section of society. There's just no need. It makes no business sense to me. Sorry, that wasn't very constructive, other than stop it. All right. I think I may have ranted for long enough, unless there's any questions in the room.
I have one question. You have an underlying assumption that it is focused, policy is focused on the individual, and therefore takes away from institutions, all the politicization of sport. Mm-hmm. So I didn't understand what you have in mind with this politics of sport, because in other sections you speak about myths that sport brings us together, which is often central to the politics of sport for its own character, rather than as opinions of people that have prominence within it, or human rights, which will be applicable everywhere else. Can you expand on this?
I would argue that's actually part of the same thing. So what I'm arguing is that women's sport is framed as this like neoliberal endeavour. So institutions aren't responsible for the growth of the women's game after it was kind of, people worked at women's sport, it was banned, it was excluded, it didn't just kind of, you know, disappear of its own accord. So what I'm arguing is that women's football is part of this neoliberal project where its development is being just left to the market and left to individuals. So sport is great, sport will bring people together in communities, and it's kind of their responsibility to grow the game. It's the women, the players themselves, their responsibility to do what they're going to do on the pitch. And people like FIFA, well, you know, then they're not responsible as institutions, because it's not like this kind of the great sport myth that sport will just look after everybody by virtue of its own positive traits. So it's not kind of like individuals versus society. It's about this kind of neoliberal project that the market will decide what is going to succeed and what's not going to succeed, and FIFA can't do anything about it. It's kind of a slightly flippant explanation. Would that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good, yeah.
Thanks, everyone. I think I'm going to hand over to Jack. If you've got slides.
I got slides, yeah. Right, you speak.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah.
Can you close the previous presentation so that we don't need to...
You know where it comes up to the... I don't use Windows. You know where the USB comes up?
USB?
Yeah.
Never had a USB. Where did you put it?
In the computer. It made a sound, so I assume it must be in there.
Go to this.
Which one? Go on, you do it.
Yes, no. Channel 2. Is that the one?
Yeah, that's the one.
Slides?
Yeah. Spot on. Thank you very much. Okay, hello everybody. I'll assume, sorry, that you can hear and see me and see the slides as well. So today's project's a bit of an odd one. It's one that I'm currently working on, and it's ended up being the merging together of two separate projects, which weren't originally meant to be merging together. So the first one is the project is allied and part of the sort of tackling online hate in football project, which is an AHRC funded project that I'm currently working on. Which is looking at examples of online hate during international football tournaments. And one of the things we wanted to do as part of that project is we wanted to take a specific event such as the Euro 2020 tournament, and we were interested in looking at criticisms of the Take the Knee protests that sort of took place during that tournament. One of the strange things that emerged though was when we focused on the criticisms that were sort of directed towards the protest, was how many of them were focusing on what we refer to as conspiracy theories, and in particular alt-right conspiracy theories as well. So whereas there's a history of studying the far right in sport, there's not much written on the more recent alt-right. And more oddly, what I found, this ought to be a bit odd, was the fact that how on earth has the alt-right gone from a few sort of discussion boards online to now being spoken about during an international football tournament. So it was seeing those connections there, which we sort of focused on and we were sort of interested in. So what I'm going to sort of look at today is we're going to be looking at 1,388 tweets that were collected during the tournament. And specifically what I want to focus on in this talk is I want to look at how conspiracy discourses were being used as part of the criticisms of Take the Knee. And more importantly, what I want to sort of suggest here is that perhaps this is one way in which the alt-right has become more prevalent within contemporary society, and perhaps look at as well how these sort of, most of them are crackers. When you really look at these conspiracy theories, they are crazy. How these sort of crazy conspiracy theories are now entering popular discourse on sport around a particular tournament, such as Euro 2020. So over the course of this presentation, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to first of all talk about the alt-right and its emergence. I'm then going to focus a little bit on conspiracy theories. And then I'm going to focus on two conspiracy theories which were prevalent during the tournament, which was the cultural Marxist conspiracy and what has been referred to as the woke agenda. Okay, so we'll begin with the alt-right. So multifaceted and complex, the alt-right remains both a contradictory yet widely cited phenomenon. Serving as an abbreviation of the alternative right, it is at its heart a far-right white nationalist movement that has criticised both liberal and conservative politics. The movement bears no central organisation, coalescing around the protection of white identity in accordance with the values of Western civilization and Christianity. Though the aim of the alt-right is to achieve a white ethno-nationalist state, its hostility has been directed towards a host of apparent detractors, including liberal democracy, academics, the media, political elites, immigrants, multiculturalism, feminism, neoliberalism, and egalitarianism. Indeed, what remains integral to the alt-right movement, however, is its use of digital online spaces. Alt-right messages are often shared across a variety of online platforms, including YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, as well as finding wider encouragement and discussion amongst online podcasts, messaging boards, and the creation and sharing of online memes. By drawing together various online subcultures, the alt-right has served as a fulcrum for aligning white nationalist movements with a largely online identitarian politics based on aggressive forms of online trolling and, more importantly for this study, conspiracy thinking. So, when we look at conspiracy theories and in work on conspiracy theories, we're often seeing that a key attribute underlying the reported conspiracy is the perception that there remains a them willing and working to deceive us. If we consider this them in relation to far-right conspiracies, then outside of the conviction that this agent is in some form or another working to orchestrate a decline in white civilization, the underlying motivations of this agent are never clear nor justified. Rather, it is the deception enacted by this agent that seeks to further cement the existence of anti-white racism. What is more, this agent exists beyond the usual power structures or positions of government, occupying instead a position behind the scenes. These convictions provide a compensatory delusion to the wider social, economic, and political changes that are believed to be working towards the detriment of white groups. Consequently, in the case of alt-right conspiracies, what I draw attention to is the very way in which these characteristics are projected through a perceived loss of control, or in the perception that minority groups are being used by some hidden ulterior elite to promote divisive forms of racial aggression, a key proponent of which is the emergence of conspiracies associated with the Black Lives Matter movement. What is important is that sport is not excused from these concerns. Rather, in criticisms that were directed towards BLM's protests regarding issues of racial inequality and discrimination, SPARC became a key site for conspiratorial discourses to be enacted and shared online. In fact, what seems to underlie the perpetuation of alt-right conspiracy theories is the harmless ambiguity with which such conspiracies are expressed and relayed. Indeed, while the effects of conspiracy go some way to perpetuating the ideas and beliefs associated with an evil and threatening other, often the propagation of online conspiracies function by relying on a level of justifiable sincerity. That is, it is not necessarily the hostility at the offensive online slogan or the plausibility of the conspiracy that results in its dissemination across news outlets, but rather the very fact that conspiracy can be plausibly denied. Ultimately, the result is one in which the racist conspiracy or offensive statement becomes digitally laundered through mainstream channels that end up debating their legitimacy or reporting on their significance as part of accepted public discourse. In so doing, online conspiracies and examples of online trolling work to frame more obvious forms of offence and provocation through innocuous forms of argumentation. So it's through this sort of harmless ambiguity, this sort of the innocuous way that certain statements are made, that they end up getting perpetuated in news reports and, as I'd argue, in sort of this public discourse as well. So that might be one way in which they tend to cross over from sort of fringe movements to more mainstream discussions. Certainly, it is possible to dismiss such conspiracies as professing nothing more than an epistemological relativism, from which the targets of the conspiracy can vary depending on the required enemy or scapegoat within a particular demographic context. In much the same way that the content of the racist conspiracy can change, be it the Jew, Muslim immigrant, or global cosmopolitan activist, conspiracy theories can just as easily be adapted, reinterpreted, and exchanged. For this reason, it is the modality of conspiracy, indeed the fact that there is a conspiracy going on, that proves significant. Indeed, for the alt-right, such conspiracies are usually levelled at the expansion of what is referred to as either a cultural Marxism or, more recently, a prevalent woke agenda. So I just want to focus on these two briefly before moving on to the data. Though its origin can be found in the Nazis' anti-communism, the term cultural Marxism has come to denote a far-right anti-Semitic conspiracy centred upon the conviction that the work of the Marxist intellectuals, most notably the Frankfurt School, that's them there on the slides, continue to undermine Western white civilization. Today, the conspiracy can be traced to far and alt-right groups, where it has become more popularly used as criticism of progressive movements amongst the alt-right. In so doing, the alt-right has capitalised upon the term as part of its conspiracy discourse. Certainly, the term has had real-world effects. In 2011, Anders Breivik killed 77 people in Norway, citing cultural Marxism as a major proponent in eliciting white genocide. The term was also used by members of the Trump administration, most notably former Chief Strategist Steve Bannon. In the UK, criticisms of cultural Marxism have found their way into the popular press, where in 2007, Paul Dacre, the then editor of the Daily Mail, claimed the BBC had been captured by cultural Marxism. In 2019, current Home Secretary Suella Braverman referred to the Conservative Party's battle against cultural Marxism, advocating for the party to defend free speech and other liberal institutions. Later in 2022, however, she referred to diversity training as woke witch trials. Indeed, Braverman's comments emphasise how the intersection between alt-right conspiracy discourses and wider public and political reinterpretations of a cultural Marxist agenda are increasingly related to the term woke. Emerging within the US, the term woke was adopted as a means for signifying an awareness amongst Black Americans towards day-to-day examples of racist discrimination. The term gained wider global recognition in light of protests by the BLM movement, which was subsequently organised around incidents of police violence towards Black citizens. Since then, however, the term has taken on more negative associations, with many criticising its transference to the UK as reflecting on ongoing cultural war on British values, beliefs and practices. Together, it would seem that woke criticisms have helped to engineer a platform upon which a clear sense of moral righteousness, tasked with exposing those in power who stand opposed to ordinary people, can be established. Here, the anti-woke conspiracist is positioned as the defender of free speech and moral enlightenment, drawing from the apparent neutrality that is invested in one's capacity to inquire and debate within a free and rational society. So, importantly, in what follows, I do not seek to lay credit to the absurdity of a claim which suggests that professional footballers have suddenly become competent in Marxist economics, so much so that their decision to take the knee forms part of a wider plan to overthrow capitalism, undermine Western civilization, and destroy white society. Rather, what I seek to expose is the extent to which the modality of conspiracy formed an important part of the criticisms levelled towards the Take the Knee protest. That is, I am not concerned with debates regarding the political effectiveness of taking the knee, or whether fans were for or against it. Instead, in what follows, I focus specifically on how criticisms of the protest were constructed and framed through online social media posts that drew heavily from conspiracy discourse. While this helps to situate sport within wider political debates on racial inequality, I draw attention to the very ways in which the claims of the alt-right gained greater traction in public discourse, in this case, social media posts related to Euro 2020. So the tweets I'm about to show you, I'm going to split them up into two categories. I'm going to first look at those that portrayed the BLM as a Marxist organization, because there's some interesting comments they make about it being a cult. And then I'm also going to be focused on tweets that referred explicitly to a woke agenda. I'm not going to read the tweets out because there's too many. So I'm just going to have the tweets on the slides and I'm going to talk around them. So as I'm talking, I'm sort of going to elaborate upon an analysis. I've highlighted important sections in bold as well, which highlight that as well. So we'll start then with the Marxist organization. In accordance with alt-right attacks against an assumed cultural Marxism within Western liberal societies, it was clear from the Twitter responses that a perceived enemy, in this case the BLM, was itself seeking to use the protests as a way of promoting a cultural Marxist political outlook. Here, tweets alluded to, or rather outright proclaimed, a clear relation between the BLM movement and the expansion of an avowedly Marxist political agenda. Certainly, this linkage echoes previous efforts amongst the alt-right, which have sought to produce an alternative path to the BLM's desire to destroy white society through undermining traditional white institutions such as the church and nuclear family. Though much of this is reflected in well-known far-right and alt-right conspiracies, what proved apparent from derisions of the protests was the conviction that any support for the movement was not a genuine attempt to highlight examples of racial discrimination and inequality, but a more profound and overriding example of the indisputable division between an all-encompassing and all-powerful Marxist BLM and a white society standing to defend democracy. While one tweet encouraged others not to show support for those commie wankers, in other examples, such animosity was once again fueled by attempts to highlight BLM's anti-white sentiment, wherein the association between Marxism and BLM was explicit. Indeed, despite holding no formal political position, either in local or national government, it was evident that the efforts of BLM had proved successful in forcing many to support and partake in the protest. The degree to which England team were merely sheep following the Marxist BLM was itself reflected in tweets that commented on the BLM cult. And this is just a few, the cult references, there was loads of them within the data. Accordingly, suggestions that the BLM were in fact being run by a political elite and a Marxist-led media helped to compound a sense of conspiracy in criticisms of the protest, one in which both politicians and the media were secretly working behind the scenes to promote BLM's Marxist agenda. As you can see there was these bizarre examples where Boris Johnson was seen as a proponent of Marxism and actually putting through a left agenda as opposed to the conservative one he's sort of lived his whole life. Though it was never detailed exactly how political elites sought to control democracy via the protest, other examples drew heavily from the concern that the protest was being promoted by media outlets who were themselves either being controlled by or were in secret support of the BLM's Marxist agenda. So you get this in regards to notions of a white elite or an elite taking part in this. So it has been widely noted that the alt-right maintains a paranoid suspicion of media discourses whose mainstream coverage is usually perceived as pushing a liberal media agenda. In certain cases, alt-right initiatives have sought to deliberately provoke the media in providing coverage regarding anti-white issues and specifically media biases that, in their view, remain anti-white. For many, this media coverage has itself been criticised for providing a space in which right-wing discourses can be promulgated to wider populations. What we see in the above examples, however, are suggestions of a conspiracy between the mainstream media institutions and the Marxist BLM movement. Whether this centred on calls for evidence or calling out Marxist media bosses seeking to cover up the fact that certain players were not kneeling, derisions towards the protest evoked an element of conspiracy at play. As touched upon in the reference to woke media, which we see there, such conspiracies were further emphasised when matched with wider criticisms of wokeism. Okay, so in tweets which sought to suggest that the tournament had succumbed to a woke agenda, references to Scotland's decision, albeit late, to take part in the protest were frequently discussed, with many seeking to frame their frustration with the English national team as part of a political pandering to woke demands. So this was another thing that came up a lot within the data as well, this idea that the protest, taking the knee, didn't actually mean anything, it was just a performative gesture. So with the protest perceived as nothing more than a form of performative activism, one tweet asked, whatever happened to freedom of expression? In fact, in light of the global woke trend of kneeling, frustration towards the very ways in which wokeism was undermining the tournament was subsequently directed towards the England manager Gareth Southgate and the UK woke establishment. Evidently, criticisms of both the media and Southgate were clear to point out the very extent to which they had been overridden by a woke agenda. I mean, there was lots of racism directed towards black players in these tweets, but there was tons directed towards Gareth Southgate as well, who was really seen as sort of this symbol of this sort of woke England, left-leaning England squad as well. And you can see that from there on the board. Much of this would focus on Gareth Southgate in particular. So the concerns that the tournament had been hijacked by the Marxist BLM and woke mob coalesced in a mode of conspiracy that specifically sought to emphasize the political biases secretly controlling both the tournament and the media. Ultimately, such concerns were brought to bear in references to the alt-right phrase cuck or cuckold. Originally, the term cuckold refers to a pornographic genre where a married man submits to watching his wife have sex with another man, or in some instances, group of men. Typically, the genre aligns with examples of racist fantasy, whereupon the white man watches his wife have sex with a black man or group of black men. To this extent, the term deliberately draws upon and signals a degree of fear and paranoia towards the racial other. Indeed, what became apparent from the above tweets, however, was the sense in which the phrase served to support conspiratorial discourse predicated largely on a sense of insecurity and a worrying conviction that the Take the Knee protest promoted and upheld an anti-white agenda. So, as I say, I've had to work, apologies for rushing through them. Hopefully you're able to see the way in which some of the data was being represented. I do just want to sort of bring this to a conclusion now with the following points. I highlight the following trends that was clear within the data. First, in opposition to the alt-right, it was clear that both the protest and BLM were positioned as supporting a leftist political agenda. For many, the capacity of BLM to elicit such control over both the tournament and the English national team was akin to a cult. These concerns followed a path of racialization, which often sought to position the protest as promoting anti-white biases within sport. What was clear from these tweets, however, was the underlying sense that ulterior motives were being hidden and that the public were not being told the real reason for the protest adoption. Second, amongst much of the derision directed towards BLM, it was clear that this was exasperated by concerns that the movement's underlying objective was to promote a Marxist political agenda. Here, criticisms of the Marxist BLM were situated in accordance with alt-right conspiracies regarding cultural Marxism. The promotion of an apparent cultural Marxism was supported by a number of agents working behind the scenes in order to promote a decidedly woke agenda. In this case, certain political elites such as Boris Johnson, popular media institutions, including the BBC and Sky Sports, and team officials and media personalities, notably England manager Gareth Southgate and BBC presenter Gary Lineker, were perceived as deliberately promoting the protest as part of their submission to woke demands. Across each theme, I emphasised the conspiratorial nature of these discourses, the fact that for many, examples of anti-white bias were being promoted and distilled through the Take the Knee protest. Accordingly, while I make no assumptions as to the political allegiance of the above tweets, I underline the extent to which conspiratorial discourses associated with the alt-right provided a framework through which the protest could be understood. Specifically, it was through the modality of conspiracy that examples of anti-whiteness were perpetuated in online Twitter discussions of Euro 2020 and Take the Knee. It is for this reason that I consider the importance of conspiracy as being central to a wider dissemination of alt-right ideology across popular cultural contexts such as sport. I position this term to conspiracy and the relative success of the alt-right in proliferating conspiracy theories as reflecting a broader cognitive inertia that was supported by a certain conspiratorial conviction that assured those with the knowledge of the conspiracy that one does in fact know the truth. This points to the importance of conspiracy today and to the failures that can arise when the turn to conspiracy within public discourses is dismissed as nothing more than mere paranoia. On the contrary, conspiracies remain an effective means for far-right and alt-right ideologies to find greater traction amongst public debates on racial inequality and discrimination, and not least international sporting competitions. Rather, from the above analysis, what I draw attention to is the very space that our digital media platforms provide in allowing for the appropriation of conspiracy to be mapped. This points to the systematic organisation and administering of online spaces that allow the racial conspiracy to be proposed and examples of racism to be maintained. Okay, nice one. Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it there. Is there some way you can see the questions? Or? Yeah, go for that then.
You mentioned at the beginning about how you thought that mainstream channels are digitally laundering.
Yeah.
And it's the tweets. So could you say a bit more about that, and perhaps what do you think the responsibilities are of journalism, the industry, and how they deal with these? Like, do they shed light on them? Do they them? Like, what should they do?
It's good. I'm glad. I'm not sure if I should use that in the title, actually, that digitally laundered term.
I thought it was really cool.
I know it's from Adam Klein's work. It's quite good. What's quite interesting, so Adam Klein looked at it started, I think it started in Australia, and then it appeared over American campuses in 2017. There was a slogan, "It's okay to be white," that was created by the alt-right, and it got stuck to like university buildings on campus. And I think it started in Australia, and then it moved to the US, and it was actually reported in over here as well. So because it became this story, because it had gone from like small online forums to actually being, people living it, to the point where it's on material buildings, it then had to be reported in the news. So then they gave space to discuss it. And what they found out was that they found the original online forum where it was being discussed, and it was done deliberately by the alt-right. The alt-right they knew the statement was ridiculous, but they deliberately put them out in this sort of organized effort so they could get mainstream newspapers and mainstream press, to discuss the issue. And what it does is it puts the media in an impossible position, because they're left debating. Number one, they're giving space to a nonsense message, but then they're also left in the position of having to defend that, actually having to say, yes, it is okay to be white, which is not the point at all. And so it was quite clever in a way that the alt-right had used it, and that's what we mean by digitally laundered. It sort of ends up, first of all, on online forums, and then gets laundered, through the media, where it becomes exacerbated and it becomes reported on. And all the while, you're giving space to alt-right messages. And I think there's a few examples, particularly from Alan Klein's research, and another fellow called Sengel, who talks about the fact that it was all done deliberately. It was done, the alt-right knew that the message was nonsense, but they thought by giving it space, then you'd actually have to end up defending that it's okay to be white, which is, again, not what anybody's asking, nor the point of the debate. So I think that's one way it gets used. We didn't get that one during the Euro 2020 coverage, but it was all the other stuff that we were sort of getting around it as well. So like the references to cucks, which is often used on alt-right forums, but also, as I say, grounded it in this criticism of cultural Marxism and wokeness was the one that was getting, predominantly used in criticisms. Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're ridiculous. Yeah, and I think it was getting particularly ridiculous when they added like the politicians in that mix as well, and Gareth Southgate, which I thought was quite funny. I say it's funny. You got to laugh, because when you've read like 1,300 of these, the world's crackers. We're doomed. The apocalypse is now. Alison?
That was actually going to be my question, Jack.
Yeah.
Just imagining reading through comments like that, so negative, so much racism, anti-Semitism, etc., etc. Is there anything you have to do to protect yourself? Because that must be so draining reading through that.
No, I enjoy it. I think we enjoy our racism. So for me, it's like a dirty little space where I can live out racist fantasies.
I don't believe that at all, Jack.
But I think, I don't know. Yeah, it's you just have to. As I say, I'm working on something at the minute around memes, around comedy, because a lot of them rely on humor, but they're using humor in different ways. And I do think humor's sort of this thin path between sort of, I suppose, a good racist joke compared to just an outright racist joke, if you believe there can be such a thing. But if you just got to turn off you don't turn off your brain because you need it on, but it can be a bit
kind
hard,
of distant.
but,
yeah. Thanks, really interesting. Way out of my knowledge area, really fascinating. Thank you.
No worries. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Jack. Thanks for that. Really interesting. So you've shown us a lot of tweets from people you're saying are crackers and are, probably quite clearly nutters.
Yeah.
Do you think that these kinds of people have always been there to the same extent, but now they've just got a collective megaphone where it's far more obvious that they're there, and now they're able to collect and be this movement, as opposed to before it would have just been a person ranting to themselves at a bus stop?
Yeah. No, to be honest, I blame completely the politicians and the media. I think, as I said before, with regards to Beth's question there, it's the media that launder this stuff, that actually report on it rather than just outright ignoring it. And then I think one of the things, I think I know I call them crackers and you know, it could come across as a bunch of crazies online, but it was them that stormed the what do you call it, the building in the Capitol building in the US, and it's been repeated by conservative politicians quite regularly as well. This criticism of cultural Marxism and this criticism of wokeism. So I think that's where, you know, I think it's quite easy to say, oh, it's just a bunch of, you know, crazies online, and you know, perhaps now they've got this little space, but those spaces have always been there online since the internet sort of emerged. But now they seem to be, as I say, I think what sent me down this path with this study was that I just would have never expected to have seen conspiracy discourses being used to criticize a football tournament. I think that was to me where I was sort of going back to the people I work with on this project, saying we've got to go down this conspiracy angle because it's all there, it's constantly being used. So I think that's what I mean about it moving out slightly. I think, yeah, of course, I think it's already existed. Yeah, perhaps where some people might have shared it amongst friends in a pub, say 50 or 60 years ago. It definitely seems to be moving, as I say, more into the sort of public discussion, the sort of public space, public domain there, where it gets repeated and reused. But I think there's something else there going on. I do think there is a sort of a libidinal element here. I didn't use that flippantly earlier. I do believe we enjoy our racism, and I think enjoyment is a key term here. I think there's a certain fun in these. I generally believe conspiracy theories are fun. That was also something. I know these ones are awful. These are racist conspiracies, but I actually love discussing conspiracy theories, and that was part of the interest of this project. Was you got to read ones around. Oh, you're a basketball player, so what's the Michael Jordan one? Like, did he go into baseball because he was getting done for gambling? Like, one of the conspiracies is like, so there's some really good conspiracies I think out there which are quite interesting. But I think I'm not interested in the content. I'm interested in the form. I'm interested in why it is we need conspiracies. And that's what I kept meaning about the modality of conspiracy, the mode of conspiracy. Often it doesn't matter what the conspiracy is, it's the fact that a conspiracy is going on, which I think is really important. Yeah, so as I said, I do think there's this sort of, it's more of a turn to drawing upon more psychoanalytic theory to sort of explain that sense of enjoyment, that fun we get out of using conspiracy theories there as well. I think you saw that during COVID as well with all the conspiracies. It becomes you know, online fun just to post something on it as well. But no, yeah, that was a good question. Thanks.
Cheers, mate.
Yeah.
I get why you analyze the tweets for conspiracy. Let's assume the tweets are not representative of a general public opinion, but it is very specific to alt-right.
Yeah.
But when they refer to terms like cultural Marxism, they refer to something that is real, or is just something that they throw and without any analytical context? I mean, is it a reference to Gramsci, for example, or is it just something to shout about?
Well, I think it's something to shout about, because I don't think Gramsci never referred to himself as a cultural Marxist. It's, you know, no cultural Marxist scholar ever refers to him as being a cultural Marxist. And I do find when people criticize cultural Marxism, you know, the first thing you should always say to them is, well, who are you referring to? Because no one's doing cultural Marxism research. You get Marxists who are doing economic analysis of society based upon, you know, Marxist ideology, but or Marxist analysis at least. But for me, it's definitely just thrown out there. It's just become a bit like woke. It's just thrown out carelessly. You had recently, didn't you have, who's the present with a fellow who died? Paul O'Grady died, didn't he? And you had yeah, the comedian died, and who? What's her name? He didn't have a woke. Amanda Holden. Yeah. Yeah, and so these terms now are just banded really as I think of criticisms. I think, and I didn't have time to elaborate upon it in this paper, but I do think these terms get used. It's this term I want to draw upon called interpassivity, where I think they're used to depoliticize movements. I think as soon as you start saying something's woke, something's cultural Marxist, you depoliticize an issue. You're able to you move it into the world of nonsense, and then you're debating nonsense, which is similar. It's what happens with the media when they have to debate. That's why it gets digitally laundered. They have to debate this nonsense, and I think that's so. I don't. Yeah, there's no actual sense behind it. I don't think any of these people could name a single cultural Marxist or or they've read Gramsci or the work of Adorno or Horkheimer. So,
critical race theory in the States, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. As I said, I think it's challenging. Yeah, it's as I said, the samples. The only there's a couple of, there are some statisticians on the project, and they're doing some, because we've got over 1 billion tweets. So it's just, yeah, over 1 billion. So we're currently, they've created like an algorithm that is now looking at on a statistical scale. I think it's quite fun though to just take a selection sometimes and delve into them, because although this is obviously a particular segment of that sample, it's actually quite good to look at what's actually being said sometimes. I think that gets lost in the statistics stuff, which again becomes largely negative most of the time. But, yeah. Cool. Okay. Yeah. Nice one. All good. All right. Thank you. What do? I feel like I'm in power now, don't I? Goodbye, everyone. See you later. I'm ending you all. Are you going to do it for this? Go. I don't want to take charge.
Thank you very much for the presentations, and thank you very much for being around for this. This week it has not been very popular with the weekend Easter coming through and no lessons. So thank you.
I was in that room down there.
The next presentation is going to be on the 19th, I think, 19th of this month. So hope to see you there. And if I don't see you around, have a very nice break. And thanks again. Bye-bye.